So let's talk about a guy who inherited one of the biggest fortunes in Europe, gave every penny away, and then tried to solve all of philosophy, not once, but twice. First, he was so sure he'd cracked it, he just quit. But then years later, he came back to solve it all over again in a completely different way. This is the incredible story of Ludwig Wittgenstein, one of the most brilliant, most difficult, and most contradictory thinkers of the 20th century.
And this sentence, this is like the mic drop at the end of his first masterpiece. It is so final, so absolute. It's like he drew a line in the sand for all of philosophy, forever. It's the kind of thing you say when you are absolutely convinced you've found the final answer. But, that's where the story only gets more interesting. And this is where you really start to see the puzzle of who Wittgenstein was. I mean, his father was basically the Andrew Carnegie of Austria, but Ludwig chose to live in this tiny, bare room with just a bed and a chair. He was a decorated war hero from World War I, but in his private journals, he called himself uncommonly cowardly. And get this, he writes a book he thinks solves philosophy for good and then just walks away to become a school teacher in a tiny village and a gardener's assistant at a monastery.
So that's the big question, isn't it? What on earth drives a person to these extremes? To even begin to understand the man who tried to end philosophy, you have to look at his first, monumental attempt to do it.
Okay, so his first big swing was this single, incredible book that was designed to be the final word on philosophy itself.
And to really get the intensity of this guy, you have to know where he wrote this book. This wasn't in some cozy university office. No, he came up with these ideas in the trenches, on the Eastern Front, and literally finished the manuscript while he was a prisoner of war in Italy. For Wittgenstein, philosophy wasn't some academic game. It was a matter of life and death.
At the heart of his book, The Tractatus, is this idea called the picture theory. And at the time, this was an absolute bombshell. He basically argued that for a sentence to mean anything, it has to be a logical picture of a possible fact in the world. The way you arrange the words has to mirror the way things are arranged in reality. This was a direct shot at all the vague, fuzzy philosophy of the past. He was demanding total clarity.
And this logic leads to a pretty devastating conclusion. Okay, so if the world is just the sum of all facts, right? And language can only talk about facts, then what about everything else? What about the meaning of life, beauty, morality, God? Well, according to the young Wittgenstein, those aren't facts you can picture, so you can't really talk about them, and if you can't speak about them clearly, you just have to be silent.
And he wasn't kidding. He really believed he'd done it. He had drawn the absolute limits of language, and in the process, he thought he'd made all the old problems of philosophy just dissolve. So logically, he gave away his massive fortune, turned his back on the whole academic world, and the story really should have ended right there. But of course, it didn't.
Because years later, Wittgenstein had a shocking realization. He had been fundamentally wrong. His perfect picture was a mirage. And to help the world navigate the fog of his new ideas, it was going to need a guide.
So in 1929, he goes back to Cambridge, but he doesn't have a new theory. He has a whole new way of doing philosophy. He realized he'd been hypnotized, bewitched, by this one rigid idea of how language must work. And now he had to undo it all. But his new way of thinking was, well, it was almost impossible for other people to follow.
And this is where a really crucial figure enters our story, Elizabeth Anscombe. You can see on the timeline she meets him as a student in 1942. She quickly became more than just a friend. She was one of the very few people who could actually challenge him and understand him. He ended up trusting her so much that he made her one of his literary executors. And in 1953, it was her brilliant translation that finally gave his second masterpiece to the world.
And Anscombe herself described the challenge perfectly. She said that his first book was like a face looking right at you, clear as day. But his later work, that felt more like a veiled face. It became her life's work to help us see what was behind that veil.
So, what was this radical new idea?
Well, he basically threw out the perfect picture for something much more messy, much more practical, and way more true to life. Language as a toolbox.
Okay, this slide really gets to the core of it. The early Wittgenstein said language is a picture. But the later Wittgenstein said, no, no, no. Language is a toolbox filled with all sorts of different tools for different jobs. This was a huge shift. He stopped telling us how language must work and started just looking at how it actually works in our everyday lives. The meaning of a word isn't some fixed, logical thing. It's just how we use it.
And there's this fantastic little story that shows his new method perfectly. One day he asks Elizabeth Anscombe this simple question. He says, Why do people say that it was natural to think that the sun went around the Earth?
And she gives the obvious answer, right? Because it looked as if the sun went round the Earth. And then Wittgenstein hits her with this absolute killer of a question. Well, what would it have looked like if it had looked as if the Earth turned on its axis? And the answer, of course, is exactly the same.
And that's the whole point. That's the big aha moment. The problem wasn't what people saw. The problem was the picture that was already built into their language, this hidden assumption that we are standing still and everything else is moving around us. Our everyday way of speaking creates these mental traps, these snares, that we don't even realize we're stuck in.
And all of this leads to his final, revolutionary vision for what philosophy should even be. It's not about building grand new theories. It's about untangling the knots that we tie for ourselves with our own words.
He started to see his new work as a kind of therapy. His goal, as he put it, was to fight a battle against the bewitchment of our intelligence by means of language. He wanted to show us the cage we've built for ourselves with our own words, and then show us the way out.
So philosophy becomes this ongoing activity. You don't solve it once and for all. You just get better and better at spotting the confusions. It's all about clearing away the mental rubble so that we can see the world clearly again, free from the illusions that our own language tricks us into.
And we really have to stress this. That entire legacy, this idea of philosophy as therapy, might have been totally lost without Elizabeth Anscombe. As his friend, his brilliant translator, and his executor, she was the keeper of the keys. She made sure his revolutionary later ideas could actually be seen and understood by the world.
After a lifetime of just intense struggle, both intellectually and personally, a life full of depression, self-doubt, and this relentless search for clarity, his last words were, "Tell them I've had a wonderful life." It might be the final, beautiful contradiction from a man who is just full of them.
And so this leaves us with the kind of question Wittgenstein would want us to ask ourselves. What are these snares of language trapping us today? What are the hidden assumptions in the way we talk about, say, the economy, or politics, or even ourselves, that are bewitching our intelligence and keeping us from seeing things clearly?